Our speaker today is, I'm sure, familiar to a lot of you. Elaine Mills trained as a master gardener in 2012. She enjoys growing, photographing, and sharing info on native plants through presentations, articles, and social media. One of her most popular endeavors is the popular tried and true native plants fact sheets, which are available on our website. One good news item today is that Elaine plans to share her presentation with anyone who registered for the talk today. It is a very dense presentation, and therefore she has decided to share it. So please join me in welcoming Elaine Mills. Elaine.
Thank you so much, Colleen. Welcome, everyone. I have found that the response to our presentations on sustainable landscaping has shown that there is a growing interest among gardeners in using native plants in their home landscapes, both for the beauty of the plants themselves and for the support that they provide to wildlife. Unfortunately, there are many challenges to gardeners who are looking to purchase these plants. Nursery stock tends to be dominated by non-native ornamentals. And a survey has shown that among large mid-Atlantic nurseries, they're carrying only about 25% native species. And of those limited numbers, the majority of them are only available as cultivars. There is also a lack of information on the sources of the plants and how they were propagated. And that has led to various questions. Are straight species of native plants always the best choice for home gardens? Can cultivars of native plants provide adequate support for wildlife? In the Q&A sections of previous talks, I've answered these types of questions fairly simply by saying, I would recommend staying away from woody plants where the foliage has been changed because it cannot be used by the butterflies and moths, the caterpillar stage of those insects, as a larval host plant. Similarly, stay away from changes in the shape of flowers because there will not be the proper reproductive parts that would provide nectar and pollen to our pollinators. But I decided last year that I wanted to look more deeply into this topic. For the past 6 months, I've been doing quite a bit of research, and I would like to share what I have learned with you today. To give you a quick overview, we'll begin with a discussion of botanical terms, and then we'll be looking at the results of scientific studies. These are referred to as plant trials. And these results will help, in a sense, give us some guidance in making selections of plants for our gardens. First, we'll look at 2 trials of woody plants. These are trees and shrubs. And the bulk of the talk will be a discussion of trials of herbaceous plants. As Colleen mentioned, we will be stopping at several points to answer your questions. And at the end, I'll summarize with some recommendations and resources. Classification is a way of understanding our plants, and the hierarchical system of organizing them is based on groupings of plants based on similarities in their structure. And distinctions, finer and finer distinctions, are made at each of the levels until we arrive at the unique plant, which is referred to as a species. Just to give you a concrete example, let's look at the familiar red maple tree. It's in the kingdom Plantae, which distinguishes plants from other life forms. It's in the order Sapindales, which consists of woody plants with either compound or lobed leaves and multi-petaled flowers. It's in the Sapindaceae or soapwort family. These are insect-pollinated plants. The genus is the maples, Acer, which have lobed leaves and wing samaras. And finally, we arrive at red maple, which is distinctive because of its red flowers, red fruits, and very bright red fall foliage. Species names, as you'll note, are 2-part scientific name, consisting of the genus, which is capitalized, and the species, which is in lowercase. By common agreement, this is usually italicized, and all of the terms are following the rules of Latin grammar. For a closer look at species, we could give this definition. Species are genetically distinct plants that are found in the wild in a particular geographic region. There's been no human involvement in the evolution of the species. Rather, it has evolved as part of an ecosystem. It will be interacting with other plants that share the same plant community, and it will have special relationships with animals as part of a food web. For example, a species may offer nectar and pollen in exchange for pollination services by insects. Fruit may be consumed by birds and other animals and then distributed throughout the environment. And species can also serve as larval host plants. That is, they'll be feeding that caterpillar stage of butterflies and moths. Species reproduce sexually through pollination of flowers and the subsequent production of seed. And this kind of reproduction allows genetic variability, allowing the species to adapt to changes in the environment over time. Species may also reproduce asexually, both in the wild and in our gardens by various means. For example, the mints can spread by rhizomes, those underground horizontal stems. The creeping phlox that you see pictured on the lower part of the slide spreads by stolons, runners or stems that grow above the ground. And some of our favorite native shrubs, such as Virginia sweetspire, have a characteristic referred to as suckering, where they form sprouts at the base, and they could even form colonies over time. The term cultivar is an abbreviation of the phrase cultivated variety. And this refers to a very specific category of plants in which there is a larger role of the horticulture trade in bringing these to market. The plants are named and propagated by a nursery, and the name will appear in single quotes, not italicized, following the species name. So for example, the flower that you see pictured here is Phlox paniculata, bright eyes. Cultivars of native plants are sometimes referred to as nativars. There are two types of cultivars. The first type can originate from a naturally occurring individual mutation within a species. This may be discovered in the wild by a horticulturalist, and there may be characteristics that are judged distinctive enough to bring this plant to market. Sometimes this kind of a, quotes, discovered cultivar is referred to as a natural selection. This kind of cultivar may be produced commercially by seed, allowing it to be as genetically variable as the straight species, or it may be propagated vegetatively, that is by taking cuttings for volume efficiency in a large nursery. Let's take a look at just one example. This is Robin's plantain, Origeron pulchellus. And one particular mutation with very fuzzy foliage and a dense mat-forming habit was found on a property near Virginia Beach, Virginia. It was named for the nearby Lynn Haven River, and it now has the full name Origeron pulchellus Lynn Haven carpet. The second type of cultivar comes about as a result of selective breeding for certain traits that are preferred by humans. These could be a change in color, an extension of the period of bloom time, a change in the size of the plant. You can think of this kind of breeding as a more advanced form of the pea breeding that was conducted by a biologist, Gregor Mendel, who demonstrated the transmission of genetic traits. This selective breeding will take place perhaps even over a period of years in order to arrive at the form that is desired. And then at that point, the cultivar will be propagated vegetatively in order to retain those desired traits in the offspring. Therefore, these will be clones, and they will lack the genetic variability to promote the biodiversity that we see among species or the cultivars that are reproducing by seed. The chosen cultivar names often reflect a featured characteristic of this bred cultivar. For example, this cultivar of purple coneflower is named Pink Double Delight to emphasize those extra petals. Quite often, these names will be quite flowery, screaming yellow, raspberry ripple. These cultivar names are added to the plants to make them sound especially appealing for sale. These kinds of cultivars may also have a trademark name. Just as one example, arrowwood viburnum goes by the scientific name Viburnum dentatum. The cultivar name is Christum, but it is often sold under the trade name Blue Muffin. A third type of plant that we need to discuss before getting to the trials is a hybrid. This results from a cross-pollination between two separate species in the same genus that level just above species. This can occur in nature when plants are located in proximity. This could happen either with wind pollination or the carrying of pollen by a pollinator from one plant to another. The resulting seed will grow into a new plant. But most of these hybrids are created by plant breeders, and these are the type that we'll be considering in the trials today. Hybrids combine the traits of both parents, and ideally, the fact that it is a hybrid will be indicated by an X in the scientific name. So here's an example. We'll actually be seeing this particular hybrid a little bit later on. This is a result of a cross between two straight species, blue wild indigo, Baptisia australis, and yellow wild indigo, Baptisia spherocarpa. The new plant is named Baptisia cross varicolor, and it has the additional name Twilight. And you can see that it displays intermediate characteristics. It's kind of a blend of the colors of the two parents. Before we look very closely at the trials, I wanted to call your attention to the handout. For those who would really like to go back and see the original scientific reports, I have given a link to all of those. What I have done to make concise summaries is to highlight some of the results that were found, and then in bold type to indicate the conclusions that were arrived at by those who conducted the trials. And as Colleen mentioned, there will be PDFs of the slides because they are very dense. On the second page and moving on in the handout, you'll see sometimes head-to-head comparisons of straight species and cultivar plants. The check mark indicates that pollinators preferred one or the other. And I've also gone to the trouble of researching the provenance of these particular cultivars. Sometimes it takes quite a bit of effort to find these. And this will indicate whether a plant was a result of a natural mutation or whether the cultivar was bred. So let's take a look first at several trials of woody plants. The first is a study conducted by Emily Baisden, a graduate student at the University of Delaware, and her mentoring professor, Dr. Douglas Tallamy. This was conducted at the Mount Cuba Center in Delaware, and their stated purpose was to study the potential impact of cultivars on insect herbivores. They were focusing especially on the feeding of the caterpillar stage of butterflies and moths. Just as a little side comment, Doug Tallamy often refers to what he refers to as the 10-step rule. That reminds us that this feeding is a natural process. It's not going to be totally destructive of the plant. And if we take those 10 steps back from the plant, we will barely see any of the feeding going on by these caterpillars. In this particular trial, they measured the effect of 6 traits of trees and shrubs on this kind of feeding preference. And as you can see from the photograph, the insects were collected via vacuum sampling. The first factor they wanted to look at was the impact of leaf color change. And they compared 3 species, they're shown vertically on the left, with 3 pairs of cultivars. And the cultivar change resulted in either bluish, purplish, or reddish foliage instead of the standard green. There was a clear feeding preference for the species among the insects. The replacement of chlorophyll in the original species by either anthocyanins or carotenoids to bring about that color change in the foliage was seen as a deterrent to feeding. And therefore, their conclusion was that species with unchanged leaf color really is the best choice for these plants to serve as larval host plants in our gardens. They also looked at the impact of intense fall color. And again, they chose 3 species and cultivar pairs. Arrowwood and red osier dogwood are shrubs. Red maple is a tree. And the cultivars have more intense color. There again was a clear feeding preference for the species. And their conclusion, species with unchanged fall color, this was sometimes referred to as enhanced color, is really the best choice for larval host plants. They also looked at 4 other traits, and rather than showing all 3 pairs, I've just singled out a few to give you the idea. For growth habit, they chose sweet gum and the slender silhouette cultivar. For disease resistance, they chose Appalachian spring cultivar and the straight species flowering dogwood. For variegated foliage, silver and gold was one of the cultivars of red osier dogwood. And for enhanced fruit size, they looked at the Chandler cultivar of high bush blueberry. The results for these particular traits were more mixed, but they ended up deciding that there was no evidence that these particular traits were going to have a negative impact on the insects that were using these. Therefore, they decided that cultivars are acceptable to insect herbivores as larval host plants if the cultivars have been bred for these particular traits. As a little sidebar, I'd like to talk about several of the very popular woody plants that were not described in the trial. And we'll be looking at them in terms of the various impacts that they were discussing. So the first is the impact of leaf color. Common 9-bark Physocarpus opulifolius has lobed green leaves, and it is the host plant for the caterpillars of quite a few moths. This particular shrub is perhaps one of the most popular in the horticulture trade. And as you can see from that left sidebar, there are at least 20 different cultivars of the plant. Some of them have been modified for height, but by far, most of them have been modified for leaf color. So while these are very attractive, very appealing to us as gardeners, they are purely ornamental and they will not be able to serve as larval host plants. Looking at the impact of modified height, another very popular native shrub is Virginia sweetspire, Itea virginica. The straight species plant grows 6 to 10 feet tall, but there are quite a few shorter cultivars, just 2 of them shown here. This particular plant is a host plant for the American holly azure, and while the leaves and flowers of the cultivars appear to be unmodified from the straight species, they should still be acceptable as larval host plants and sources of nectar and pollen for our pollinators. Another example for modified height, this is black chokeberry. The straight species grows 3 to 6 feet tall, but there now are newer, shorter cultivars that are available in the trade. Lowscape mound is as short as 12 to 18 inches, and it's often used as an edging or ground cover plant. The leaves and flowers of these shorter forms will be unmodified, and the cultivars would still be acceptable for caterpillars and pollinators. But a question arose in my mind whether the fruit of the shortest cultivar, which is close to the ground, would be comfortable for birds to feed at that level. I know that bluebirds, for example, and chickadees and titmice particularly like the fruit of black chokeberry. and they tend to feed at higher levels. I consulted with a Master Gardener colleague of mine and her husband, who is an avid birder, and they suggested that perhaps if the fruit was appealing enough, the birds might be able to feed at that lower level. But this is just a question that may need further study. And finally, the impact of fruit size. Chandler was the cultivar of high-bush blueberry that was considered in the Baisden Tallamy study. When the leaves and flowers of this species are modified, the cultivar should still be acceptable for caterpillars and pollinators. In fact, Doug Tallamy indicates that the Vaccinium genus is a very important keystone genus supporting 288 species of butterflies and moths. But a question arose in my mind about the impact of this enhanced fruit on birds. The Chandler cultivar has the world's largest blueberries, measuring the size of cherries. And in a scientific paper that is cited on your handout, I learned that larger fruits often require more manipulation on the part of the birds in order to get them into position to swallow. And in fact, they may be hard for the birds to swallow. So something you may just want to consider. While the harvest of these larger fruits would be wonderful for us, maybe it wouldn't be the best for the birds. Now, moving on to the second of the woody plant trials. This was conducted by Mount Cuba. This is the only trial that they have conducted on a woody plant species. So this was focusing on wild hydrangea, Hydrangea arborescens, and various cultivars. The trial was conducted back in 2017 over a period of 4 years. The straight species blooms on new wood, and you'll note that the inflorescences, those large clusters of flowers, consist of hundreds of tiny white fertile flowers. You can see all the reproductive parts. The flower color is not affected by pH of the soil, as it is with non-native species of hydrangeas. Some early cultivars that were very popular were Grandiflora and Annabelle. These were naturally occurring variants of a mophead mutation, but they were found to have weak stems and a rather floppy habit due to the large size of the flower heads. So newer cultivars were developed, and Mount Cuba wanted to particularly focus on them in this trial. These newer cultivars were the result of selective breeding for certain desirable garden traits: compact habit, sturdy stems, and even some new flower forms and colors. Those flower forms take two shapes. There are the lace caps, which consist of fertile flowers, like the straight species, in the center, surrounded by a showy ring of sterile flowers. The other type are the mop heads, which consist of masses of sterile flowers with only a very few hidden fertile flowers. And while they are popular with us, they will not support the pollinators. In the Mount Cuba trial, they looked at pollinator visitation to these wild hydrangeas and cultivars. And these observations were recorded by a citizen scientist in a group called the Pollinator Watch Team. The lace cap, predictably, was preferred over the mop head. And you can see here's where the straight species ranked. Here it is again. It had 209 visitations by pollinators, and therefore, as you can see, it ranked generally as preferred among the lace caps. There was one cultivar, however, the Dardum cultivar, that actually ranked above the species. Deborah Delaney and Lindsay Cathcart of the Dare to Bee, BEE study group from the University of Delaware conducted their own more detailed pollinator study within this larger trial. They actually filmed the inflorescences at 10-minute intervals and then went back to review the footage and actually count the different types of insect visitors. And I found the results of this in what they referred to as profiles very interesting. You can see them displayed in the graph at the top. The dark green shows how bumblebees and carpenter bees are pretty much visiting all of the different species and cultivars at around the same rate. And the same was true for that light green bar that represents the visits by the sweat bees. But as you'll see, there is variation in the other bees, the beetles, and the flies. And the question arises in my mind, is it the shape of the flowers? Is it the offering of pollen and nectar? What kinds of variations are there that bring about these differences in the visitation? And are these important? Would they make a difference in our recommendations as to which plants we should be growing? Colleen, we can pause at this point to answer any questions about the woody plant trials.
Alrighty, we have a few. One questioner said that she's always told that purple coneflowers are not native to Virginia.
That is true. They are native more to the Midwest, and we will be discussing that particular plant, which is very popular in the horticulture trade, in the second part of the presentation.
Okie doke. Do you have any comments on seed saving for cultivars?
I have to admit that I have always been obtaining my plants as small seedlings or as plugs. So I don't have a lot of personal experience with seed saving.
Okay. And finally, not a question, but a comment. A fellow Master Gardener commented that your handout is superb and she plans to use it as a shopping list the next time she goes to a native plant nursery.
Wonderful. That is so satisfying to know that
Yes.
my research is paying off in actually usable information. So thank you so much for that compliment.
Okay, there's a late arriving question here. Which native plant would be most beneficial for biodiversity? Chokeberry, aronia, or chokecherry, prunus?
I am familiar with the chokeberry, Aronia arbutifolia. Chokecherry, I believe, is still a native plant, and I don't know why the straight species would not be perfectly acceptable for both of them. But as to the question on seed saving and this particular question, I will be happy to look a little further into the topics. And I always produce what I refer to as an addendum document that I send out to all of the registrants. And those would be some of the questions that I could look into further.
Okay, thanks, Elaine. We can move on.
All right, thank you so much. Now we'll begin looking at some trials of herbaceous plants. And the first one is the Penn State Extension Pollinator Trial, referred to as Big Bees, Bugs, and Blooms. This trial was set up to evaluate native plant species and cultivars from the standpoint of attracting pollinators. And as you can see, the Master Gardeners of Penn State planted a tremendous number of plugs at their state research center. They monitored them weekly and then evaluated both the plant vigor, the blooming, and of course, the insect visitation. In comparisons head-to-head of various species and cultivars, these are some of the results. For each pair that I've shown on this slide, the species is shown on the left and the cultivar is shown on the right. Some of the cultivars, Claire Grace and Purple Dome, were naturally occurring cultivars. Husker Red and Fireworks were bred cultivars. Vivid had an uncertain origin. But these are the numbers of pollinators, and these are the conclusions. The straight species was preferred, or in the case of obedient plant, equal to the cultivars. You can read many more details about these various plants in the handout. Here are some more comparisons. Jacob Klein and Bluebird are naturally occurring cultivars. Summer Sun was actually developed in Germany. And interestingly, for the aromatic aster and threadleaf coreopsis, there was a three-way comparison between the straight species and not one, but two cultivars. Here are the numbers for those comparisons. And the final result, the cultivar was preferred. The conclusions in this trial were that it appeared that in these 14 direct comparisons, about 50% of the time, the species were seen to be better, but in other cases, the cultivars actually outperformed the species. So they said that it appeared that it's not always possible to generalize that the cultivar or the species is better than the other. This particular trial also resulted in some other interesting numbers. They rated the top 20 plants for total pollinator visits. And you'll notice the phenomenal numbers associated with Pycnanthemum muticum, clustered mountain mint. Now, I'll be providing the PDF of this slide so you can look at it more carefully at your leisure. But I wanted to note several other things. The two Solidago goldenrod also had fairly high rankings. And this is notable because Doug Tallamy names the goldenrod genus as the top keystone genus for supporting the Lepidoptera. So knowing that these particular plants will support not only the caterpillar stage of our Lepidoptera, but all of our pollinators makes them really outstanding. Another interesting point is that two of the white flowers, Rattlesnake Master and Hyssop Leaf Thoroughwort, not particularly showy, maybe not even used that frequently in our gardens, actually had quite a good performance. And here's a look at the second group from 11 to 20 of those top plants for pollinator visits. And a few hybrids and cultivars actually turned up in this listing. The study also arrived at conclusions about the top 10 plants for insect diversity. They actually discovered that there were 72 distinct insect species that were visiting the plants. And the numbers you see are the average number of individual species for each of these plants. So Pycnanthemum muticum, again, rose to the top, closely followed by one of the Solidago species. And again, these white-flowered species are right up there at the top. Another comment that they made is that the flowers that consist of complex inflorescences, large clusters of very small flowers, tended to have many more visits than flowers that just simply had a central cone and large individual petals. And I know you'll want to take a close look at this particular slide, which lists the best plants in their estimation for attracting specific insects. Moving on to the second pollinator study, this was conducted by Annie White as research done for her PhD dissertation at the University of Vermont. She wanted to evaluate differences between native wildflowers and cultivars as far as supporting pollinators. And she set up plots at two research sites on farms in Vermont. 11 species were paired with cultivars, and she visited them at various times during the growing season. And as you can see in the picture, she's noting down the visitation rates. Site A was an organic farm, and bumblebees were the most frequent pollinators, followed closely by honeybees and other bees. Flies were next, and the other insects, including butterflies and moths, were many smaller percentages lower. Site B was a conventional farm 114 miles away, in fact, on the other side of the mountains. Bumblebees were much more seen here, followed by flies and other bees. Honeybees did show up, but only in September and October. And here's a look at some of the initial matches. You can see here that the species were preferred over the other forms by the numbers of visitations. Strawberry Seduction and Golden Jubilee are cultivars. These are bred cultivars. And the other four plants matched with the species are actually hybrids. In fact, the red grape is the result of a cross between three separate species. And here are the final conclusions on that. Here are some additional pairings, and you'll note that two of them are repetitions of the pairings from the Penn State trial, Monarda fistulosa and Claire Grace, and Penstemon digitalis and Husker Red. In both cases, the results echo that of the Penn State trials, and the straight species are strongly preferred. In this third matching here, orange coneflower and the gold sturm cultivar had fairly close numbers. Looking below, Hello Yellow differed really only in its color. Otherwise, the form and the bloom time are identical. The most interesting result in her estimation was the fact that the Lavendel term cultivar that was bred in Germany had a much higher visitation rate than the straight species with white flowers. So her conclusions repeat those of the Penn State trial. Cultivars really need to be evaluated on an individual basis. And this slide is quite complex, but if you would like to get a closer look at exactly which pollinators are visiting which species and which cultivars, you can look at this at your leisure. Another aspect of this trial by Annie White was an evaluation of purple coneflower and cultivars. This is continuing the work of her thesis advisor, Leonard Perry. And the reason for conducting this particular trial was that Echinacea purpurea is one of the most widely promoted species. It's the subject of intensive breeding, and there are at least 200 varieties available in the horticulture trade. Now, the focus for the breeders is on selecting traits that are valuable to ornamental gardeners, but she wanted to study to evaluate the benefits, potentially, of cultivars and hybrids to the pollinators. So this research was conducted on those same 2 farms that were part of the large study. And again, she conducted 5-minute observations. These are the 4 plants that were evaluated in the study. The straight species, Echinacea purpurea, species grown from seed. And as I commented in response to that earlier question, this particular plant is not native to the mid-Atlantic. It's native more to Tennessee, the Midwest, but it does grow quite well here, and it's very popular in our gardens. The second form was a popular cultivar, also grown from seed, differing only in its color. The third form was the Pink Double Delight I referred to earlier. This is a patented double-flowered cultivar, and this is propagated by cloning. And the final plant being studied was Echinacea Sunrise, a very complex cultivar resulting from a triple cross. And here are the results: 729 pollinator visits, primarily bumblebees. White swan had a lower number of pollinator visits, and the numbers get lower for the more modified forms. Bees strongly preferred the species and then the white swan cultivar over the other forms. Butterflies and moths had equal preference for either the species or white swan, and the other insect visitors really exhibited no strong preference. Now, Annie White gave greater strength to the results for the bees and their preferences. For one thing, they were by far the most numerous visitors to the plants. And it's also important to note that bees use both nectar and pollen in adult and larval stages. So therefore, she concluded that the breeding of cultivars and hybrids tends to decrease pollinator support, and she strongly recommends the straight species of Echinacea. Looking a little more closely at the effect of certain traits on pollinator visitation, this is the effect of color. She notes that color is a significant signal to pollinators, and it enables them to discriminate flowers at a distance. Bumblebees in particular use complex systems of communication to improve foraging efficiency, and they prefer colors that they have learned are associated with high floral rewards. In other words, more nectar and more pollen. So therefore, she recommends the Echinacea purpurea. Looking at the effect of size on pollinators, she states that compactness is going to equate with fewer flowers and therefore fewer floral rewards in a garden. So if possible, if you are planning a pollinator garden, it's best to make use of the vertical space with taller plants. And as you can see, the straight species is the tallest of these different forms, and she recommends that. And finally, she was looking at the effect of the sterility trait on pollinators. The straight species and white swan are both fertile They can be reproduced by seeds. Echinacea purpurea pink double delight is sterile because it is double flowered with the extra petals replacing that central cone. And therefore, it's going to reduce the floral rewards. The sunrise echinacea was actually bred to be sterile because this process will increase the bloom duration. But as she notes, that's going to affect nectar and pollen production. So she again gives high marks to the straight species, but also says that white swan could be an acceptable cultivar. Her final recommendations are that traditional breeding is really done with traits that humans find desirable. And as shown in this advertisement, these are the traits that humans are looking for. But she suggests that breeders should also introduce selections that maximize nectar and pollen production in order to support our pollinators. A final component of her study, she was looking at nectar production, comparing it between straight species and hybrids. She was measuring nectar in very small amounts, in microliters, with some very small tubes, and she used a device called a refractometer to measure the sugar concentration. She has quite a lengthy discussion on nectar in her thesis, should you want to refer to that. But I'd like to just summarize very quickly the comparison of lobelia species and hybrids. The two straight species are Lobelia cardinalis, cardinal flower, and Lobelia syphilitica, great blue lobelia. And she also looked at two hybrids, fan scarlet and fan blue. The straight species cardinal flower has quite a high production of nectar, and this is very appropriate for the pollinator, the hummingbird, that needs a larger amount of pollen as it feeds. Great blue lobelia produces a significantly lower amount of pollen, but this is perfectly appropriate because this is a bumblebee pollinated plant. The fan blue hybrid had a slightly higher amount of nectar, so it could still be acceptable for bumblebees. But the nectar produced by fan scarlet was by far the lowest of all the types, and therefore hummingbirds would still be attracted to these plants because of the red color, but they would come away undernourished. So her conclusion, hybrid modifications of flowers can have unforeseen negative impact on the floral resources for wildlife. Any additional questions at this point, Colleen? I'm not hearing any questions, so I am going to move on to look at some additional research on herbaceous plants. This was conducted at the Mount Cuba Center, which is a nonprofit botanical garden in Wilmington, Delaware. And at the Mount Cuba trial, they focus on growing plants that are native to the Piedmont region of the mid-Atlantic. They evaluate those plants and related cultivars and hybrids. And these are multi-year trials that will, as much as possible, simulate home gardening conditions. Plants are rated on a 1 to 5 scale. And those conducting the trial are looking at these characteristics: floral display, by which they mean the color, the size of the flower, its abundance, how long lasting the floral display is; habit, which refers to size of the plant, the quality of the foliage, whether the plant might flop or whether it needs cutting back or staking to maintain a tidy appearance in the garden. They also looked at winter hardiness and disease and pest resistance. And the results of these trials are published in reports. They began doing this in 2005, and they've been continuing to the present. In addition, Mount Cuba has a goal of introducing desirable new plants to the nursery trade. The first of the trials they conducted was back in 2002, when they grew 56 species from the Asteraceae family. Now, for this trial, they were simply measuring plant performance on that 1 to 5 scale, but they were not looking at the benefit to pollinators. But it's interesting to note that the bluebird cultivar of smooth aster and the October Skies cultivar of aromatic aster, which received high rankings from them, also did quite well in the Penn State trials. The cultivars ranked more highly for pollinator visits than the straight species did. The Mount Cuba trial gave a 3.9 out of 5 ranking to the Purple Dome cultivar of New England aster, and they described it as being more manageable than the straight species. But you may recall that in that Penn State trial, Purple Dome rated much lower than the straight species for pollinator visits. Coreopsis was the second trial in 2012, and here are some of the highlights of that trial. They noted that tall Coreopsis, Coreopsis tripteris, did very well as far as its performance in the garden, but they tended to find it too large for the average home garden at 8 feet tall. I'll note that Coreopsis tripteris did rank fairly high as far as diversity for pollinators in that Penn State trial. The Zagreb cultivar of Coreopsis verticillata ranked above the species as far as garden performance, but I will remind you of this three-way comparison in the Penn State trial, and Zagreb had a much higher visitation than either the straight species or the moonbeam cultivar. Now, in this particular trial, they also conducted a pollinator diversity study. And here are the results of that. This is, again, a complex slide, and I'll let you look at this at your leisure. But just a quick summary. Each different plant supports a slightly different community of pollinators. And particularly for Coreopsis verticillata, they note that 91% of the pollinators are bees and flies. But the wasps, natural predators in our garden, are also important. They further discuss the fact that it's important to study how color, shape, and pollen production may have an effect on these different preferences. Another trial looked at Heuchera hybrids derived from either Heuchera americana or Heuchera villosa. Most of the plants in this trial were rated simply on their foliage. There was a separate rating for floral display, but there was no data collected on use by insects. As a sidebar comment, I'll say that the species of hairy alum root, Heuchera villosa, was not tested. The species of Heuchera americana was given a mediocre score, and the comment was that it had insignificant flowers. But my comment is that both of these Heuchera species are larval hosts, and both will provide nectar and pollen for small bees, including the specialist bee pictured here. So in my estimation, they should be considered as preferable over the top-rated hybrids grown for foliage color. Moving on to the Baptisia study, they were looking at 46 selections, and they actually included species outside of the mid-Atlantic. For this trial, they were focusing primarily on floral displays, looking for lush, sturdy foliage. They mentioned that Baptisias can be used as a food source for bumblebees, and they're also a larval host plant, but they provide no comparative data. They gave a very high ranking to the Twilight hybrid, giving it a ranking above the straight species and a dwarf variant. But you'll recall, perhaps, that in Annie White's trial, the straight species greatly outperformed that hybrid. Looking at the Monarda trial, they grew 40 hybrids or selections of bee balm and wild bergamot. Now, breeders focused on creating compact plants, disease-resistant with large flowers. And it turns out in this trial that the compact hybrids performed particularly poorly. Now, the trial focus was looking at habit, mildew resistance, leaf retention, and flower coverage. And these are some of the comments that they made. The particular plant pictured on the cover of the report is the Judith's Fancy Fuchsia hybrid. They also singled out a third native species, Monarda punctata, spotted bee balm. These were highly ranked because they have abundant, long-lasting flowers and excellent resistance to powdery mildew. Looking more closely at some comparisons head-to-head, they gave a fairly low score to the straight species of wild bergamot because its resistance to powdery mildew was very poor. Claire Grace, the naturally occurring cultivar, was given a very high ranking, in fact, the highest in the trial. And this is because of its good resistance to powdery mildew, as well as its sturdy upright habit. You'll see in this little study, citizen science project on visitation, they were looking specifically at visitation by moths and butterflies, and Claire Grace was clearly at the top, but a reminder that the species was not tested. Now, the species actually came to the top for visitations in both the Penn State and Annie White trials. So gardeners can make the decision, is it preferable to have the resistance to powdery mildew, or are you more concerned with support for pollinators? Another comparison was with the straight species of scarlet bee balm and the Jacob Klein cultivar. The species had a very low score. They stated that it has low flower coverage and poor resistance to powdery mildew, whereas Jacob Klein has vigorous, abundant flowers and fair resistance to powdery mildew. In the related citizen science visitation project, they were looking at visitation by hummingbirds, and Jacob Klein far outranked the species and the other hybrids that they were looking at. But a reminder that the species had a closer ranking to Jacob Klein in the Penn State trials. And this trial, of course, was looking at visitation by a whole range of pollinators, not simply hummingbirds. Another trial was conducted for phlox, both for sun and shade. For the sun-loving species, they were especially looking at 66 variant forms of garden phlox, Phlox paniculata. Now, the trial was focusing on flowers, foliage quality, habit, and powdery mildew resistance. And the Gina cultivar, a naturally occurring form that was found along the Harpeth River in Tennessee, clearly ranked at the top with a score of 4.8 out of 5 among those Phlox paniculata cultivars. You can see it here. It rated as exceptionally mildew-free foliage with an impressive floral display. Part of this trial also involved an evaluation of butterfly preference. And again, Gina was overwhelmingly preferred. You can see from this chart here that it ranked well above any of the other cultivars. A University of Delaware graduate student determined that there was no particular correlation between this high butterfly visitation and the quantity or sugar content of the nectar. Rather, he thinks it has to do with the smaller flower size compared to the straight species. And this means that the flower tube may be a bit shallower and allow butterflies quick access to many flowers. As a testimonial, I can state that swallowtails are frequent visitors. I grow a high preponderance of native plants, but my particular garden is in a pollinator food desert. And I tended to growing other cultivars of phlox to only see different types of bees. But last year that I introduced the Gina cultivar, I saw the swallowtails, and they would nectar for 15 minutes at a time. An important reminder in this report by Mount Cuba is you want to remember not just the adults, but the larval stage of butterflies. So don't forget the host plants. And for swallowtails, that would include sassafras, spicebush, and swamp magnolia. Looking at the phlox for shade, they grew multiple selections of both woodland and creeping phlox. They were simply focusing on the habit, vigor, and floral display. There was no data on use by wildlife. And their summary conclusions were that creeping phlox, Phlox stolonifera, was easier to grow, and woodland phlox had a significant problem with powdery mildew, resulting in defoliation. In the Helenium trial, they grew 44 different forms of Helen's flower, Helenium autumnale, and southern sneezeweed, Helenium flexuosum. Now, these particular plants are native to the Americas, but interestingly, most of the breeding has actually taken place in Germany and the Netherlands. So the origin of some of the hybrids and cultivars is unclear, but a few summary comments. The can-can cultivar of Helenium autumnale ranked just above the straight species. And it was given those scores because it was floriferous and disease resistant. The species of the southern sneezeweed, flexuosum, also had a fairly high ranking for profuse flowering and less need for staking. But in looking at visitation statistics, the straight species of Helenium autumnale came out on the top. And if you look more closely back at the slides for Penn State, this particular species was in the top 10 for insect diversity and in the top 20 for total visits in the Penn State trial. And it topped the hybrid by a great margin in Annie White's trial. In 2018, Mount Cuba decided to repeat the earlier 2007-2009 trial of Echinacea. And this, again, is because, as Annie White noted, this is an extremely popular plant in the horticulture trade. They grew quite a number of species, cultivars, and hybrids, including the species native to Tennessee and the Midwest. And there were some problems with some of them being short-lived, but they also added, this time around, a pollinator study. And the majority of the visitors were bees and wasps. There were some butterflies. The fragrant angel cultivar, which topped out above the straight species as far as garden performance, also was slightly higher ranked as far as visitations by pollinators. And here are some of the other scores. A very noteworthy part of this particular report on Echinacea is a reminder that you want to choose flowers with all the reproductive parts. In this cutaway, you can see how this central cone of the Echinacea has all of the reproductive parts, and they will be producing the pollen and the nectar. When petals replace the cone, as seen here, there's no production of pollen or nectar. The flowers are sterile. Carex are becoming quite popular in the horticulture trade. These are wind-pollinated plants, but they do offer seeds and cover to wildlife, and they also serve as larval host plants. This particular study evaluated vigor and adaptability of these plants to both sun and shade. And an interesting component was to compare how these different plants did when they were mown to assess them as potential lawn substitutes. So folks who are interested in adding this plant to their gardens will want to look at the details of this report. And finally, the most recent report is one on Amsonia that literally came out just a month or so ago. For this trial, the longest running trial from 2013 to just last year, they rated 20 different forms, including some species that were native to the Southeast. They were principally evaluating the plants for their habit, vigor, and floral display, but they did conduct some observations toward the end of the trial as far as interaction of the pollinators with the plants. They saw a fair diversity of pollinators, butterflies, native bees, and hummingbirds, but there were, in general, low numbers. This plant is also a host plant to the snowberry clearwing. Finally, just a quick reference to an ongoing study at Oregon State University. This is the doctoral work of Jen Hayes. I came across this because I saw some blog posts at OSU's Garden Ecology Lab. Jen Hayes is conducting field trials to compare West Coast native species and cultivars. So far, she has collected data on pollination visits and diversity and is analyzing those. Very interestingly, she's also gathering nectar samples that are going to be analyzed in the lab for sugar content and volume. And she's also looking at the nutrient composition of pollen samples, particularly the lipid-protein ratios, to see about the potential effect for cultivars versus species on adult bees and developing larvae that would use the pollen. And she's also using an interesting technique of multispectral photography for analyzing UV markers. And this is because changes in fluorescence among cultivars may be confusing to pollinators. So, an interesting study to follow for the future. As I mentioned at the outset, I used to give a fairly simple answer when asked about the preference of species versus cultivars for use in our gardens. And as you can see from this presentation, the research I've conducted shows that it's a much more complex situation. So these are my final comments for today. We really have a wide spectrum of choices, and these are going to be based on gardener priorities. We're looking here at benefit to pollinators because they are the category of animal that is making the greatest use of the plants. I've made reference to the birds, for example, in looking at the effect of fruit size, but most of the trials were really looking at pollinators. So for those who are very concerned about the ecological value, people who are involved in conservation projects, they are obviously going to use not just the straight species, but in fact, what is referred to as the local ecotype of that native species. They're going to want to grow plants from seed that was collected in a particular area because they want to preserve that plant community, that particular ecosystem, and all the interrelationships between the plants and insects there. Folks who are growing simply for ornamental concerns will be unconcerned about whether forms of plants are highly modified, either cultivars or hybrids. They're looking for the showiness of the flowers and the foliage. But many of us, and I suspect those who have been attending the talk today, are trying to create sustainable landscapes. And so we have several different choices. We can grow the unmodified native species. We know that these have long-standing interrelationships in plant communities and relationships with animals in the ecosystem. Of course, we'll want to grow those that are native to our own regions. But we might also want to consider natural mutations of these native species. Of course, we want to be aware of the origin of the plant. And this is where that looking into the provenance comes in. Certain plants, for example, may have originated from the far southeast. If we try to grow them up in Vermont, as Annie White did, they might not be as successful. We might, from time to time, also consider moderately modified cultivars, those that have been changed through breeding for size or disease resistance. We'll want to judge these cultivars, either the natural mutations and those that are bred on a case-by-case basis. But we will still want to stay away from those highly modified cultivars or hybrids that result in sterile flowers, providing no pollen or nectar. Woody plants, especially where the leaf color has been changed, these can no longer serve as larval host plants. And we need to be aware that hybrids will sometimes have unknown effects. So generally, the fewer changes, the more beneficial these plants will be to our wildlife. To finish up, I'll point out a few references that I give you links for in your handout. We have on our Master Gardeners of Northern Virginia website fact sheets, the so-called tried and true fact sheets that give you lots of information, not only about the characteristics of the plant and their benefits for wildlife, but techniques on growing them and how you could even use them as replacements for invasive plants. The Digital Atlas of Virginia Flora will tell you county by county which plants are native to the state of Virginia. The Plant Virginia native site will give you access for free to downloadable PDFs with guides that are specific to different regions of the state of Virginia. So take advantage of those. You'll also want to look at the Virginia Native Plant Society website for further information. Of course, for those of you who are attending from other states, Maryland, New Jersey, Pennsylvania, there will be comparable native plant societies to refer to. And for those, of course, who are looking to buy native plants, I highly recommend looking for native-only sellers. In our region here in Northern Virginia, go to the Plant Nova Natives website to see not only those sellers, but lists of seasonal plant sales. For folks who are in the state of Virginia, outside of Northern Virginia, again, the Virginia Native Plant Society website is ideal for that. And I've also provided the link for the Maryland Society. Do we have any final questions?
Yes, we do, Elaine. I'm sorry about the last section. My Zoom quit on me, but this one is from your middle section, and you addressed it, I think, a little bit with the Oregon study, but she wanted to know, is there any data comparing the quality of pollen and nectar in cultivars, which were preferred to the straight species?
It looks like in these plant trials that I've reported on so far, there are really just numbers, just the quantifying of the visitations without necessarily analyzing more deeply what the reasons are behind those pollinator preferences. Looking at the handout, you'll see some of the comments that were added by Annie White. For example, she'll say that the cultivars that were bred for an unusual red color are not going to be visited by bees because that color cannot be seen by the bees. But it's really going to be studies like the ones that are conducted by Oregon State University that are going to begin to dive a little bit more deeply to analyze the pollen and the nectar more closely.
Yeah, okay. This is kind of a philosophical question, but do you think there will ever be a labeling system to know which plants or species serve as the best hosts for pollinators?
I'm not really seeing it so
Yeah.
far. In fact, as I mentioned, a lot of the emphasis is on salability, making the plants catch our eye as gardeners as we're shopping. That's clear in the bred cultivars from the naming. They're given all these very flowery names, sometimes relating to candy or other types of food. And as I mentioned, the labels will sometimes be very simple. They may not even give the full scientific name. They may just tell you maybe the genus and the cultivar name. And I think the assumption by the nurseries is that many of the gardeners aren't really knowledgeable about the scientific names, about the derivations of the plants, and that these extra scientific names might be confusing. So it takes a deep dive, and it took me in some cases looking at countless websites to try to find out whether a plant happened to have been a natural mutation or whether it was the result of very intense breeding, sometimes not even in this country.
Yeah. Listen, Elaine, I know this represents a lot of work over the last 6 months, and you will be delighted to see all the thank yous that are pouring into the chat box. There are no more questions, just many thank yous,
Okay.
with which I concur. Thank you for this really comprehensive, wonderful presentation. Someone commented, "You're the gold standard," and I couldn't agree more.
Thank you so much. One final comment is that we may really want to remember the motto of the Audubon at Home ambassadors who provide visits to gardeners who are interested in really looking to support wildlife. Let the animals decide. If these trials are showing that pollinators are preferring one type of plant or another, then take that into account in your planning and making plant choices. So I know this has been very complex. This is the most complex presentation I've ever given. I've actually weeded out countless slides because I didn't want to overwhelm people. But I hope that the handout will be very helpful for you to look more closely. And as we've mentioned, the PDF will be available so you can really look more closely at the actual images and analyze those numbers if you wish. So thank you again, everyone, for attending, and I wish you happy gardening.